Okay, so in this tutorial, we're going to walk through the kind of basics of keyframing animation, talk about the timeline, and also get into some more advanced camera techniques, more advanced than we've been using, rendering out using like the kind of perspective view here. All right, so the first thing I want to do, I've already saved my scene and created my default workspace in a new folder. I'm going to make a Skydome using the Arnold Skydome, and I'm going to create a render node using an 360 degree JPEG and night scene there. And then I'm going to also go into my poly modeling tab. I'm going to make a plane. I'm going to make a sphere on that plane, roughly that size, and then I'm going to drag the sphere to the front kind of edge of the Z plane, and then I'm going to duplicate special in the negative direction along the Z. So under edit, duplicate special, go in a little white box, and it looks like 2.5 would work. And I'm going to make, continue, 9 copies of that along the negative Z, X, Y, and Z axis. No rotations, a copy and copy under parent. All right, so I'm going to say apply. That looks great. And I'm going to close. I'm going to go into my 2-pane view over here. And let's see here. Select my plane and then drag it down so it's just under the sphere. And up until this point, if you've been following my tutorials, I've been rendering out of this perspective view. So rotate around, left mouse button, and then option on a Mac, and then just rendering directly out of this perspective view. The only issue with that is that it doesn't quite give you the kind of ultimate camera controls, and it doesn't really give you in this 3D viewport kind of like a final perspective view. So I'm going to show you a couple of things that I like to do. All right, so we're in this perspective view. I'm going to split into a side by side, and then I'm going to add a camera. So we've been getting this perspective top, front, and side view camera here for free. They kind of exist invisibly within the scene, but I can also create an additional camera. So first I'm going to go up to create, and then camera, and then select camera. And when I do that, you can actually see I get this camera object that I can drag around. So in my perspective view, I can, when I zoom in and out or rotate, there's actually a little invisible camera that's moving around in the scene. And I can see that if I switch this view over here under panels into perspective into that camera 1 view that I just created. And then if I drag this camera in that scene, you can see that I am actually kind of like moving when I move the camera, I'm actually changing the viewport over here in my camera 1 viewport. I can also rotate, like move in and out with my scroll wheel, or that option left mouse button kind of drag, and you can see the camera start to rotate as well. So this has been happening when we've been in our perspective view. It's just a special case camera that doesn't show up in your 3D viewport. So I'm gonna kind of zoom in and out, and I like to kind of get into rough position over here in my 3D viewport because it's kind of faster and easier. And then I like to go in over here and just start kind of like dialing in like super, like more granular moves. And with the wheel on the mouse, you end up getting these kind of like hard clicks, you know, in the kind of zoom in and out. But with this drag, you get this really beautiful kind of, I'll call it algorithmic, or like geometric rather than algorithmic kind of modification to your viewport. All right, but I'm not getting the full viewport over here while I'm doing that. So I am going to do a couple things. I'm gonna shut down my attribute editor by clicking on the attribute editor tab. I'm actually gonna, see if I can drag it. No, I'm going to turn off my outliner for now, just so I can get more real estate over here in my 3D viewport. And then I'm going to do something over here called resolution. Turn on my resolution gate. And so the little white box with the blue circle, and in my at the top of my 3D viewport. And then I'm also going to turn on my safe action. So this is if you work in print, this is kind of like your safe bleeds. So I'm going to kind of move my camera here so that all of these spheres are more or less kind of like centered within the safe action, and I'm looking like pretty close here at the front sphere and looking down the line because we're going to be playing a little bit with the camera settings, including depth of field. All right, make sure if you haven't at this point, like save the scene, and we're kind of set up with our spheres, a plane, my Skydome, the additional camera that I can see in my outliner is now camera 1. And now I want to talk a little bit about since we're getting into animation, the timeline down here. So the timeline, these outer numbers here talk about all of the frames that are available within your project. These inner numbers, 1 to 120, talk about the frames that are viewable in your timeline here. So I can see I start on frame 1 and end over here on frame 120, but I can also slide the slider to the end of my timeline, which is frame 200. If I wanted to start on frame 1 and end at frame 100, I can change this start on frame 1 and then change this outer bounds to 100. And then my timeline automatically updates, as does this little slider. If I want to view in these like 20 frame sections, this is great. I can kind of slide through 20 frame sections, and you can see the time slider changing up here, and I can slide all the way to the left. I'm on frame 1 up to frame 20. If I want to view all of the frames in the slider, I can drag my time slider viewport bar out, or I can just like type it in. So frames 1 through 50. If I type that in, I'll see frames 1 through 50. If I want to see the whole thing, I can say 100. And then I can see here that I'm on frame 1, and I can click through my timeline, and my frames will show up here in this little gray bar. If I want to type in a certain frame, I'm like, I need to go to frame 15 and do something special, then I can also type that in here. So you can see that will also auto update as I click through my timeline. This number updates. All right, so that's the basics. Oh, and the 24 frames per second. So for the purposes of the class that I'm teaching, we'll render out in 24 frames per second. It's enough frames that you don't see like a stutter, but it's not the high kind of frame per second that we're used to seeing with like Pixar animations. And this is only like so that you all can render within a reasonable amount of time using your personal computers. All right, so I think that we're kind of more or less ready to go. Okay, so for keyframing, there's a couple different ways that we can add keyframes. And so the routine for any keyframe is to move to the frame that you want to keyframe, in this case 1. I'm going to add a keyframe on the camera, just in case I forget and I like rotate in my perspective view or something. Turning on the gate for me, the film gate and the safe mode, that helps me remember like not to rotate in that view. But even if I do, sometimes I'll forget and I just do it. The way that Maya works, the workflow isn't as obvious that you would be rotating and like lose your point of view as it is in some of the other 3D modeling programs like Blender. So I like to insert a keyframe, like line my camera up, and then I'm like happy with that, and then I insert a keyframe. Even if I'm not going to be editing the position of my camera or animating the position of my camera, this allows me I'll do that by selecting the camera, my 3D viewport, and then hitting S. When I do that, actually let me undo that so you can. I'm going to open up my channel box editor. Bring this down. I'm going to hit S again. When I do that, you'll see all of these boxes up here get that bright red box next to them. That means that I'm on a keyframe, frame 1, and that all of these channels are keyed. So S is kind of like the big, dumb, will keyframe everything. Right? For the camera, that's actually what I want. For other situations, when I'm keyframing objects, that actually probably isn't what I want. You want to keyframe the least amount of channels possible. for this camera, I know, at least in this iteration, I'm not going to be like animating it. So it's okay for me to keyframe all of those. I actually want that. And just in case I do something like zoom in and out of this 3D viewport and I'm like, oh no, that was actually my camera. I really loved that alignment. I've got it keyframed so I can just like move my slider back to frame 1 and then it's already frame locked in there. For my other objects, let's say I wanted to create a bouncing ball. We will be doing that. I'm going to start with my sphere kind of falling down and then bouncing like a few times and then kind of coming to a rest. So I'm going to grab my sphere. It's going to kind of fall down from out of camera and I'm going to keyframe it in position here. So with my object, I've dragged it up into position and then over my channel box and layer editor, I've just dragged it up in the Y. That's the only thing that I'm changing. So I'm only going to key the Y position. So I right click on translate Y and then I say key selected. And now I can see that little red box is there. And then I'm going to want it to bounce every 20 frames. So I'm going to move over to frame 20. I'm going to drag this back down to, actually I'm going to set it to 0 because that's where the sphere started and I know that. And then I can see when I drag to frame 20, that little box turns to more of like a light pink. That means that there is a key on the channel, but this particular frame has not been keyed. But I can right click now on that translate Y again and say key selected, and then it turns bright red again. I can do the same thing a couple more times. So one way I can do that is go back to frame 1 and then copy the Y position for that translate Y, go back to frame 40, and then paste that into the translate again, and then right click, key selected, and then move to frame 60. I know that's 0, and I'm gonna right click and say key selected, and I'm gonna do the same thing on frame 80. What was that? That was 0, and then on frame 80, I'm gonna paste that translate way and say key selected. All right, so now in between frame 1 and 20, the Maya is interpolating between those two frames, back up to frame 40, back down to frame 60, and then back up to frame 80. And I think what I want to do, I'm gonna then frame 100, I'm going to zero it out and insert a keyframe, and then try something that I've been having a little bit of trouble with. So I'm actually going to increase my number of frames here to 200. We'll slide down the line. There's a couple different ways that you can view keyframes in Maya, right? So we have keys from frame 1, 20, 40, 60, 80, and now 100. The next in that logical sequence would be 120. Save my file. And I'm going to open up my dope sheet. So this is under my Windows and animation editor and dope sheet. I'm going to try shift and then box select. Oh, wonderful, it's working now. It wasn't for me in the past. So then with all of those keyframes selected, with my sphere selected, it's going to show me over here all of the keyframes associated with that sphere. I should be able now, since I ended on the down, be able to copy all of these, move to frame 120, and then paste these. So let's see, I've been having some issues with the dope sheet. Hopefully it works. So I'm going to say edit, right click, edit, copy, move my time slider to 120, and then right click and say edit and then paste. Yeah, no, it's not working. So it looks like something happened. It's been pasting these things in some really strange positions. I think I'm just like having, who knows. Let's see if I can do paste down here. Ah, I can paste down in the it's wonderful. Okay, so I'm at least able to paste down here in the timeline. So I can move, I was able to copy from the dope sheet, move down here, right click, and then save paste. And the keyframes copied down here. So let's just slide through it and see if this looks like what I think it should look like. So I'm starting high, bouncing, 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 and then here are my copied frames, bouncing, bouncing, bouncing. Wonderful. So I actually want to end in a down position. This will be more important later, so I'm going to go to end at 250, and then the next frame after 200, 220, I'm going to go to 240. Actually, no, that looks right. I think I was just kind of stopping in a funny place. So that looks great. So I'm going to end here on frame 220, and I think I pasted one frame shy. That's fine. I can fix that later. So I'm going to say end on frame. Let's give it a sec, like a moment of rest. We'll call it 230. So 230. All right. Thank you, dope sheet. Kind of worked halfway. I'm proud of you. Good job, buddy. I'm going to save file, save scene. And now I'm going to, with that same object selected, that first sphere, and I'm going to go into another animation window under Windows Animation Editors called the Graph Editor. And the Graph Editor is same thing, like with whatever object you have selected, it will show the keyframes. But it doesn't just show that there is a keyframe, it actually gives you a numeric value associated with that keyframe. So in this case, I've only keyed the translate Y of the object. But if I had other keyframes, like say on this camera, you can see that I selected the camera and then keyframed everything. So I had keyframe translate X, Y, and Z, rotate X, Y, and Z, and scale X, Y, and Z. And that's all of these keyframes right here. But for the sphere, I have this beautiful kind of graphical representation of this, what will be like a bouncing ball. And what I can do now is like grab these keyframes and like a bouncing ball, kind of make these bounces lower and lower and lower until it kind of just like dribbles out into basically stasis again. So now if I scroll through my timeline editor, I can see I start high, bounce less high, even less high, even less high, even less high. The bounces are getting smaller. And we'll get into the handles and using the graph editor a little bit more in the next tutorial. But I did want to just kind of draw your attention to that graph editor. Okay. Next thing that I want to do is, I'm going to save again. Save many times. I'm going to bring the Arnold render. I'm going to set my render settings. So under the clapboard with the little gear, I want to make sure I'm using, in this case, the Arnold renderer. I'm going to use an image format of PNG. If you're low on space on your computer, you can use a JPEG. I generally, best practices again, like whenever I'm rendering out for a client, I render out uncompressed TIFFs, lossless compression first, and then I have those stills as my kind of masters. For this class, for this exercise, we can do like PNGs, compressed PNGs, or even compressed JPEGs. Probably like quality for the test, maybe 65 or something. And that's only if you are running low on space on your computer. We're going to be using the frame and animation extension of name. Instead of single frame, we're going to actually start doing some batch rendering. So we want to do name number extension. So this is file name, the frame number, and then the .jpeg or .png. The default padding is fine. And for our test, we're just going to render out 10 frames. So start frame at 1 and then end frame of 10. We're going to be using not the perspective, but this camera 1 view that we just added. And we're going to be using probably half this size. I know at least in Blender I can do math. Can I divide? No, it doesn't look like. So 960 is what, 4 Why can't I do that? 430. No. 480. 480, and then half of 540 is 250. Half of 40 is 20, 270. And I think there's ways that we can do this in other places a little bit easier, but I'm just showing you how you set everything up here on the from the render settings side. We're going to use these like super simple defaults for the Arnold renderer. And I think I will end up adding a motion blur, but I'm going to do that in the camera settings a little bit later on. So I think that's all I want to do in the Arnold renderer. Yeah, we're going to say JPEG, quality of 65, name, number, extension, start frame 1 and frame 10, and then go in and make your resolution kind of small for the test scene. All right, so I'm going to say close, and then I can see that's been updated over here. So my image size now is 480 by 270. Okay, so from my outliner in my 3D viewport, I'm going to select my camera, and then go into my attribute editor. And there's a couple of these new options here. Well, they're not new, we just haven't used them in the perspective view. One is angle of view, right? So this is like basically kind of creating more or less of a fisheye lens effect. Focal length is this kind of like telephoto, like zoom, like what is your zoom, right? And if you are a photographer, a lot of these features are going to start making a lot of sense to you. If you're not, we're going to start with the very basics today. So angle of view being kind of like how much of a fisheye, and then focal length being like how zoomed in or zoomed out are we. I'm going to undo. I liked the kind of default. I'm going to like maybe bring that angle of view in a little bit tighter again. And then we're not going to do anything except for play around a little bit with not in this depth of field. Under Arnold, we're going to be playing a little bit with depth of field. But you can, under this Arnold tab, start playing around with like different types of viewports. The VR camera, for instance, we're just going to be using the perspective view for now. Yeah, so I'm going to enable, let me bring up my Arnold view. I'm going to run IPR current on camera 1. And I think I'm going to bring up the lighting and my intensity of my, just so we get, of my Skydome, just so we get a little bit more color data here. Okay, that looks great. Pretty good. All right, I'll go back and select my camera again. And now I'm going to enable the depth of field. And this is going to allow me to select a focal distance within the scene, so one of these spheres, and then kind of start blurring all of the other spheres the further away from that sphere that we get. So blurring towards the front of the lens and towards the back. In order to figure out what my focal distance is right here, this unit of 5 by default, I actually need to go in and select an object and figure out how far away from the camera lens it is. And I have this heads-up display turned on, so I'm going to select maybe the third sphere back that's kind of in the center of my view. And I can see here in this distance from the camera, it says 12.3883. So I get that display, I can toggle that on and off under display, and then where is it? Heads up display, and then object details. So I can turn that on and off. So that's again under display, heads up display, and then object details, and that shows me distance from the camera. So I can take this 12.383 number and then translate that into my depth of field information. So let me select my camera again, I'm going to say 12.383. This number will be different for you depending on the size of your scene and the position of your camera. So make sure you're kind of doing this test yourself. You can't just type in 12.383 and expect it to work the same way. The aperture size right now is set to 0, but the larger the aperture size, the more blur effect you're going to get, right? So if I set this like to 1, I'm only going to get like this thinnest of slice of this sphere in focus, but I can set it to like 0.5 or something, and I still get this really intense blur, but then more of my scene is starting to come into focus, and then I can start playing around with like where actually on that blur scale do I want to be. And you can use the slider and kind of just like do like render tests or just like check in on your IPR. For today's purposes, this doesn't have to be too specific, so I'm just going to kind of play around until I get a happy enough blur. That looks pretty good. All right. You can also start getting super dialed in with like some of these kind of aperture blades, curvature, rotation specifics. If you know cameras, you can basically recreate your favorite lens in Maya. For our purposes today, that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to say File, Save again. And then I also want to put a blur on my sphere, so my animated sphere. So I can actually add a motion blur to my sphere, and that is under, where is that? Okay, so the motion blur is under our render settings. I'm going to go into render settings and then enable my motion blur. I want to turn off the deformation option, and then I'm also going to turn off the camera. So the motion blur with the camera checked is actually going to add a motion blur to the camera itself. I actually only want the motion blur on this object. And then the keys is like the way that motion blur works in Maya is that it takes the samples of the 2 frames before your current frame and the 2 frames after your current frame, depending on how many frames you have set up here, and it will create kind of like a Gaussian blur and then a transparency, so that you're actually kind of seeing parts of the 2 frames before and parts of the 2 frames after in that single frame, and it creates the effect of like a motion blur from a film camera. So that is under our render settings, and then under the Arnold renderer motion blur enable, I'm going to turn off deformation, I'm going to turn off camera, and then shaders, yes, keys, default. It looks pretty good over here. I can tell that I have both the depth of field, but then also this kind of intense, more intense motion blur on this thing. All right, so UV should be okay. We'll see how that renders out. All right, so I think that's all I wanted to do with the cameras. Now I can show you rendering out to an image sequence. So we have in the past, I'm gonna shut this down, just been rendering out still images, but right now I'm gonna render out from frame 1 to frame 10, which is not very many, but maybe I'll do to frame 20 so that at least we get the full kind of like drop down as a test. So under render, I'm going to say render sequence, render sequence, and then I'm going to go into the options. I want to make sure I'm rendering using camera 1 and that I render out to a location that I know where it's going. So I'm going to go into project 4, my introduction to animation that I just made. I'm going to make a new folder, and this is render test 1. If I want to be more specific, adding the header of like project 4 is going to allow me to know, just based on the file directory name, what I'm looking at, because I inevitably will end up with like multiple projects with render test 1, right? All right, so I've selected that folder. I'm going to say select, and then I can say render sequence. So it's going to render out the frames based on the render settings that I've set in my clapboard here. So rendering out to the JPEG image, rendering out, let me scroll over here, into this project 4 render test folder, and I can see as it's rendering and completing these name, number, frame number, and then extension are being added into this folder here. So I'm just going to let that finish rendering. And I've got frame 1 to frame 10. That looks great. I can kind of bounce through these frames. Yeah. I don't even have the sphere dropping yet. So I am going to finish out from frame 10 to frame 20 here, and I can do that back in my render settings and say common, start at frame 11 and then end at frame 20. And then close and then render sequence again. Can I do that here? Yeah. And make sure I'm in the same folder and say render sequence. And then we'll keep adding to my folder. And this is kind of the beauty of rendering out stills rather than, movie files. If your computer crashes, inevitably Maya will want to crash. It means that you don't lose your data. Like all of the images have already been saved. Whereas if you're rendering out to like a movie file format first, and the computer crashes, you just lose all that render data. You can't recover it. So best practices is always to render out to stills and then stitch those stills back together. All right, great. So now I can see that I'm starting to get my sphere back down into the frame view, and I can kind of toggle through here. Yeah, I've got a very kind of slow stop motion. Wonderful. All right, so I'm going to pause here, and then I'm going to come back, and we're going to take a look at animating the camera and then stitching these stills back together.